Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
The Cows, Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Monday, September 26th, 2016. So I have been told our broadcast for today, the late Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, during one of her 31 visits to the program over the years, she consistently, almost all 31 times, emphasized why it's so important that we commit a lot more time to reading, studying, as opposed to watching television, just trying to learn as much as we possibly can. While she was making her reference to reading, she mentioned one of the books that she had recently picked up. This was a few years back, but that book was The Slave Trade, A Human History, the book we're going to talk about today. I thought it would be grand to reach out to the author, just in the spirit of Dr. Welsing, discuss his book. When I contacted him earlier this summer, he shared, this was back when Roots was reissued, he shared that he had worked as a consultant on that project as well, which I thought would be interesting to kind of hear what input he gave to the filmmakers and what he thought of the finished product. In addition to the book we're going to discuss today, The Slave Ship, he also has written about the infamous Amistad Rebellion and quite a few other books that deal with the transatlantic enslavement of black people. As I stated, he's been a consultant on films on this project, has won numerous awards as a historian. Pleasure to have him on the program joining us live, Mr. Marcus Rediker. Professor Rediker, are you with us, sir?
Yes, greetings. Good evening.
Greetings. Glad we could have you with us. And just full disclosure, I invited Mr. Rediker to be a guest on the program. I did not include our programmers from 8 to 10. He agreed. He didn't inquire about the length of the program until today and saw that it conflicted with the presidential debate. I thought he might not be with us, but he said he was going to follow through with the agreement. He'll be with us from 8 to 9. And he did emphasize I did not include the time of the program when I asked which is true. Right on. Glad to have you on the program, Mr. Rediker. Before we get started, for any folks who have not seen you or read your books before, you are a white man, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, right on. And a UVA alumnus, is that correct also?
Virginia Commonwealth University.
Virginia Commonwealth, okay. Website said University of Virginia. Glad we got that cleared up. This program, the Context of White Supremacy, I use the term racism and the term white supremacy. I use those terms as synonyms, and I use the same definition for both terms. The definition I use is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Is that an accurate definition, and does such a system exist?
Well, it's a complicated question, but yes, there certainly is a global racial order. Yes, I would agree.
Is that definition that I gave for the global racial order, what I say is the system of white supremacy. Is that definition accurate?
Well, it's certainly one among many. There are a great many different definitions of what racism is, and I'm happy to talk with you about the history of racism.
Okay. One of the things, since you're only going to be with us for an hour, I would really appreciate it if you could just, give us direct answers. Certainly clarify, explain. That's great as well. But if you don't agree with something, or if I give a view and you have a different opinion, just if you could please state that, that would be great, so we can move forward with the dialogue. The definition I found, as you stated, people do often have many different definitions of racism, which is why I try to start every conversation making sure that I share what my definition of racism is, and then also to see if the people that I'm talking to, if we are in agreement with regards to how we are thinking about defining racism, or at least what we can acknowledge to be truthful. So, yes, no, do you think that that definition is accurate that I gave for racism, white supremacy?
Well, my working definition of it is that racism is an international ideology that is historically bound up with the development of capitalism so as to rule and dominate humankind.
That's great. You still didn't answer the question. That's what I mean. If you could just, get a clean answer to the question. If you don't agree, that's fine too. Just, it would be good so we all know that moving forward in the dialogue. So my definition that I gave, do you think that that is accurate?
I don't think accurate is the right term. I think it's one definition among many, and I'm ready to talk with you about my book.
Okay. I'm just going to point out for listeners, that's the sort of conduct I would expect from a white person who could be practicing racism with that type of answer. But moving forward, one other question I wanted to ask before we get to your book. There was an author, he was writing, this is 2014, he was writing about racism, and this is a non-white author. He said, white people are often sincerely and greatly pained by racism, but rarely are they pained enough. Have you, just in your experience, you are a white man, you've been around other white people, family, friends, and what have you, in your assessment, just the first part of that sentence, is that, here we go with that word again, is that accurate, just based on your experience? Are a sizable number of white people often and sincerely and greatly pained by racism? Is that accurate to your experience with white people?
I'd say that's accurate of some.
You said it's accurate of some?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you think it's a significant, like a sizable portion of white people, they are often and sincerely and greatly pained by racism?
I would not say that it's a majority of people.
Okay. Are you often sincerely and greatly pained by racism?
I am.
Okay. How do you demonstrate, being greatly pained about this problem?
Well, one thing I've done is to write books about the subject, especially the slave ship, which is really fundamentally about the origins of the connection between race and terror. In my experience, my historical studies, I think the experience of being black in the Western Hemisphere and in the U.S. has frequently been an experience of violence and terror. And I wanted to write about that subject because I think that connection between race and terror actually began on the slave ship.
I thought that was one of the main themes of the book, The Slave Ship. I definitely want to read some of the passages and get your commentary on that. Just one quick thing I saw in your bio, apparently you shared this in some of your previous talks, that interracial sports was a big thing when I played basketball in the Richmond, Virginia high school I attended. As a good basketball player, I was an honorary member of the black community in my school. My first experience of the other world that most white Southerners never experienced. What does that mean, an honorary member of the black community? What does that mean, Mr. Rediker?
It simply meant that I was respected. I was invited to gatherings, to parties. I had friends. and it was that world was open to me by my friends.
Were these black people?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Did they? And can you kind of put a timestamp on this? Like, what era was this?
This was in the late 60s.
Late 60s. Okay, so this was not too long after what they call school integration. Is that accurate?
That's right. Okay.
And so the black high school students that you I guess were playing basketball with, or saw you playing basketball and what have you, would it be accurate to say that they didn't think of you as racist? They accepted you?
It seemed so. It seemed that they did. Yes, I would think that they did. We seemed to be friends.
And how you said that this was not the type of experience that most white Southerners would have had. So how did this differ from what typical white Southerner at that time would have been doing?
I think most white Southerners at that time didn't know very many people of African descent, and certainly didn't know them well.
Am I making a logical connection here from reading your book, just that little portion of your bio talking about you being an honorary black person? It reminded me of the section in your book where you talk about some of the slave ship sailors and captains, the term white man grown black.
No, this is not that kind of thing, as I understand it. This was a relationship that grew out of joint interests and basically playing competitive sport together.
Okay. And for our listeners, you want to explain the term white men grown black in the context of your book, The Slave Ship?
Yes, that was a phrase that was used by John Newton. John Newton may be known to many of your listeners as someone who wrote a famous hymn, Amazing Grace. He was an Englishman. He was a captain in the slave trade, and at one point in his life, he was, living in West Africa on an island off Sierra Leone, and in that time, he basically took, as far as I can tell, an African wife. He was actually working for a slave trader, and he described himself as a white man grown black. And I think what he meant by that was that he essentially lived according to the culture of that part of West Africa.
And you, in that passage where you describe Mr. Newton, Amazing Grace being the hymn, people should, or at least I think about that every time when people replay President Obama giving the eulogy after the Charleston massacre, where he did the little bit of Amazing Grace. Think of John Newton, slave owner, slave ship captain, in the passage where you're talking about Mr. Newton and white man grown black, and you say that it seems that he took an African wife during this period. You have wife in quotes. Why did you put wife in quotes?
Because I think it was essentially a relationship of domination and not a kind of family arrangement that husband and wife might normally connote. I think white slave traders in this region frequently took African wives, but I didn't want that to imply that it was a normal family relationship.
Got it. I guess if I was going to give a critique, that might be better explicitly stated. I would like to hear your feedback, because in my opinion, that's one of the ways, and I think you talk about this at the end of the book, about how the enslavement of black people frequently is sanitized by white historians, where describing these quote-unquote relationships, describing the power dynamics of all of this, often gets obscured or greatly minimized. We're not talking about this as terrorism, as you stated at the beginning of the book, and I think this comes through most consistently with how the sexual terrorism and sexual pillaging of black people during enslavement gets minimized. And I mean, even at UVA, you didn't go there, but at UVA, they talk about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings frequently as some sort of romance, not as he was and child rape at that, which is also a lot of what we're talking about on the slave ships. This is not just rape, this is child rape. What would your response to be? Because I think it might have been better to state that as opposed to just having wife in quotes, to make sure people explicitly understand.
Yeah, I do try to make clear in the book that sexual violence was a very significant part of the slave trade, that this was that sexual terror might actually be a better way to describe it. But my main purpose in that particular section was to essentially undermine the myth of John Newton as the author of this famous hymn, because the way you may know it, the way that story normally goes is that John Newton was himself a slave trader. He had a conversion to Christianity. He left off slave trading, and then he wrote that song as a kind of penance for the life he had lived up to that point. And what I discovered was that that story is not true. That John Newton was a slave ship captain on 4 different voyages. I think it was after the second one he had his Christian conversion. He continued to be a slave ship captain. He sat in the captain's quarters on a slave ship with hundreds of people below his feet on the lower deck and wrote letters to his wife talking about how I vow to do good by my fellow man, when in fact he was carrying these people into the killing jaws of a plantation system. John Newton never actually made the choice to leave the sea. He had an apoplectic stroke. He was told by the doctors he could not go back to the slave trade. And then, only 20 years later, did he write Amazing Grace. So this song does not have quite the meaning that a great many people have suggested.
Absolutely. I just do want to point out for listeners the question. I wanted a response in terms of, because I think it's a few times in the book where when you're talking about the sexual terrorism against black people on these slave ships, you do explicitly, you have a great passage where you describe it accurately as rape, and that this was an opportunity for sexual predators to come aboard these ships and have their way. And frequently, again, with these are children, frequently that this is happening to. One of the slave ships, aptly named Free Love. But there are a few other passages in the book as well where you describe it as coerced sexual services and forced sexual work. And I just, in my view at least, those are not the most actual terms if it's sexual terrorism that we're talking about. You have another portion of the book where you emphasize the terrorist aspect of keeping a slave ship operational. I just wanted to share this with some of our listeners. This is from chapter 1, just to read a little bit from The Slave Ship, A Human History. Sharks followed slavers all the way across the Atlantic into American ports as suggested by a notice from Kingston, Jamaica that appeared in various newspapers in 1785. The many Guineamen lately arrived here have introduced such a number of overgrown sharks that bathing in the river is become extremely dangerous even above town. A very large one was taken on Sunday alongside the Hibbert's Captain Boyd. Abolitionists would do much to publicize the terror of sharks in the slave trade, but this evidence comes from a slave society before the rise of the abolitionist movement. More came from the Captain Hugh Crow, who made 10 slaving voyages and wrote from personal observation that sharks have been known to follow vessels from across the ocean. That they might devour the bodies of the dead when thrown overboard. Slaving captains consciously used sharks to create terror throughout the voyage. They counted on sharks to prevent the desertion of their seamen and the escape of their slaves during the long stays on the coast of Africa required to gather a human cargo. Naval officers used the fear of sharks too. In the late 1780s, an African sailor from Cape Coast who had been brought to Jamaica by a Liverpool Guineaman and somehow managed to escape slavery and find a berth on a man of war, killed a shark that made it dangerous for sailors to swim or bathe around the vessel. He might have been a hero to his mates, but the commanding officer took a different view. As it happened, the shark had prevented a number of desertions. so this person ended up being flogged. I thought this was fascinating, and you even include a few more anecdotes, just how sharks were deliberately employed to maintain terrorism on these slave ships. Your response?
Well, this was actually something that I was very eager to study, because abolitionists who wrote about the slave trade emphasized sharks as being part of the terror of the shipboard regime. And so I looked into this. I found a lot of evidence, and you've just read some of it. But I also talked to shark specialists, and I wanted to get their scientific views about sharks. And one of the questions I had for them is whether it is conceivable that sharks were actually following slave ships all the way across the Atlantic, because basically what your reader should understand is that practically every day on a slave ship, early in the morning, the sailors would go down to the lower deck where the enslaved stayed overnight, and they would bring up the dead bodies. Those dead bodies would then be thrown over the rail, and sharks would gather around to eat the flesh. What I learned from these shark specialists is that, in fact, sharks will follow a source of food in that way. There's abundant proof of this, and I think this really does help us to understand the reality on board the ship. There was another instance that I quoted of a captain taking a woman and throwing her out to sea, basically hoisting her over the side of the boat, knowing that there were sharks nearby, and one of them came up literally and bit her in half. Now, this is in full view of the rest of the enslaved Africans on board the ship. So this, in my view, is a very conscious, willful use of the shark by the slave ship captain to create terror. Now, I also hasten to add, it didn't always work, because another thing that I thought was a very powerful process to be witnessed aboard the slave ships is that despite the fact that the sharks followed the ship, there were a great many Africans who tried to commit suicide by jumping over the rails of the ship. Now, this is underscored by a very common West African belief that in death, people's souls would, as they put it, go home to Guinea, go home to West Africa. So some people apparently thought that the only way they would ever be able to go home would essentially be to take their own lives by jumping over the vessel. So captains did things like put up ropes, netting around the rails to keep people from jumping overboard. So even this reality met its own resistance. And I think there was one particular instance I thought was fascinating. A ship's surgeon talked about a man who managed to somehow cut his way through the netting and to get into the water. Now, this is the middle of the ocean. He's going to die. But what the ship surgeon said was he was in an exultant state. He was happy because he had escaped that terror machine, the slave ship.
Mr. Marcus Rediker, the author, our guest for the evening. I wanted to get your response. These types of making a public spectacle of Black death and white power, white terrorism, this seems to be a long-running pattern in white culture. I would draw a connection from the slave ship. Certainly this same type of thing happened on the plantation pretty regularly, where you have large numbers of, or a black person or several black people where they are punished, whipped, beaten, maimed in front of other black people to enforce terror. This was a staple aspect of the early 20th century with lynchings, even though you did not have black people in the crowds necessarily in large numbers, but they certainly were aware of these events. They became public spectacles where large numbers of whites would come out to watch a black person be mutilated, castrated, killed. In the photographs, black people were certainly aware and terrorized by that effect. I would even say these police shootings where you have the snuff videos every other week of the latest black person to be tased, choked, shot, and killed by an enforcement officer. Is that logical? Is what I'm saying makes sense in terms of this long pattern in white culture, white history of making a public spectacle of black death, white power?
This is what I meant when I said that the connection between race and terror is very old. I certainly had lynchings in mind, public punishments on plantations, and the slave ship is really where this kind of public display begins, because the point of extreme punishments on board a slave ship is quite specific. The point is to make this a demonstration effect so that the violence and terror can be ruled to govern everybody else. The message in these grisly executions, which frequently followed an attempted uprising. We may want to talk about this. It turns out that uprisings on board slave ships were much more common than we long believed. There were hundreds and hundreds of these. But when they failed, and they did usually fail, the captains would make a show of force by calling everyone up on the deck and then enacting very public, grisly, brutal executions of the ringleaders of the uprising. These would be, things like cutting off body parts, making those people watching hand them from one person to the next. And of course, the message is always the same. If you oppose the order of the slave ship, this is what you can expect. So this kind of violence is very deep and very old.
What if you have I don't know if you have the exact information, but I would appreciate, just what your assessment is, given you've been writing for a number of years now, and you go out and give talks and what have you at different bookstores and venues. The demographics of your readers, do you get a sense of whether predominantly white people are reading your books, or is it mostly black people? Do you think it's an even combination of, white people and non-white people?
I think it's a mix. Certainly the talks I've given I've spoken to many different venues, from universities to museums to community groups. I think there is, it's certainly a mixed audience. I think there are differences in how people receive the message. For example, when I published The Slave Ship, I got a fair amount of hate mail. And these were from angry white people who always said the same thing. Why do you want to write about this? That's all in the past. And of course, my point was that it's really not in the past, that the slave ships are still sailing, and we need to take this history on board. The thing that I've noticed from African American audiences is that this is, to a considerable extent, history that is known but suppressed. And so people have been quite grateful for the public nature of the discussion, for presentations that talk about things that they already knew, but in fact are not widely acknowledged in the society.
Interesting. What is your response, talking about things that are not widely known or talked about? What would be your response? Because there are some people who take the position, and there's scholarship that would support this as well, that there was a sizable presence of black people in North America predating the enslavement of black people, and that the focus on slave ships, the transatlantic slave trade, that a lot of that is done deliberately to obscure the fact that there was a presence of black people in this part of the world that was before enslavement. What would your response to that be?
Well, I have not I mean, I think there is some evidence for that, but that's not really what I study. That's in an earlier period. So my impression is that the study of the slave trade is not meant to be a diversion from that. I think that's still an open question among scholars of when African people first arrived in the Americas.
Okay. One thing I definitely wanted to include in the sexual discussion, and we've talked about this. I don't know if you read The American Slave Ghost by Ned and Constance Sublett. Was published at the end of last year, which is great information in that as well. But I brought the same issue up with them, and we read Edward Baptist's "The Half Has Never Been Told" at the beginning of the year.
Right. Yeah.
And I think
he was a former student of mine.
Oh, well, how about that? But his book and your book, both of you all talk about the rape of black females and how that's one of the defining aspects of enslavement of black people, but neither book includes the rape of black male slaves. And I think that's something that does not get very much attention at all. That also was very widespread amongst all of this. How come that was not touched on as well in your book?
It's simply because I didn't find any evidence about it. There was one piece of evidence that I came across which was ambiguous, and I suspect it did have to do with the rape of a male slave, but there's just not much evidence to go on. I talk about the things that I could find concrete evidence in the archives to discuss, and there's just very little on that, partly because that subject was such a taboo that even though it probably did go on, very few people actually mentioned it.
I'm sorry, were you going to share something else?
I was going to say that I think it is probably more common and better documented in plantation societies than on board slave ships.
I know Mr. Thomas Foster, he's at DePaul, his report, The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under American Slavery, does not deal with slave ships, but that's a source I always bring up. And there are others that talk about it in the context of the plantation, but most of the time I have not seen when those, and it's not talked about that much at all. That's why I generally try to bring it up when we talk about enslavement of black people, because that seems to, as you said, to be a subject that just does not get talked about at all, and people leave out as though it didn't happen, and I think it's hugely important. There was a portion in the book as well, and I thought this also seemed to be a regular theme in the book, at least from my perspective, that the sailors on slave ships, it was a pretty grueling life. They had a high rate of mortality, didn't have the best food, that this was, not a pleasure cruise for the white slave ship sailors in all of this. And towards the end of the book, you write, almost everyone was a captive in one way or another and subject to an institutionalized system of terror and death. This is from chapter 5, where you're talking about the enslaved black people and the sailors. And I just wanted your response to, I guess I would say, it really does not sit correctly with me when I have a white person who even suggests that the white sailors were also victims, or in some way they were also being oppressed by this tyranny, given the clear power differential of being a sailor, even if you're the lowest level on the totem pole, white sailor, and the enslaved black people. What would your response be?
Well, my response is to say that sailors were like prison guards, and they are most certainly in a different position of power compared to the enslaved. This is a very important theme throughout the book. On the other hand, there is a violent system of discipline that applies to sailors alongside the more extreme system of discipline used to try to control the Africans on board. Probably you and your readers know about a man named Alaura Equiano. He was an Igbo man from what is today Nigeria. He was captured and probably at the age of 10 or 11 taken on board a slave ship, and he wrote much later in life, after he had gained his freedom, his account of the slave ship is really one of the most important sources we have because it's one of the relatively few that's written from an African perspective. And what he says fairly early in his book, this is it's very widely available if people want to read it. He said that at sea, when they had boarded this very strange sort of machine called a slave ship, it wasn't very long out before he witnessed the captain beating a sailor. And actually, that sailor died. He beat that sailor to death. And Equiano made a very interesting comment. He basically said, the captain used this kind of violence to try to further intimidate the Africans on board. Because what we must see is that if he will treat a white man that way, how will he treat us? So my point is that there was a dual system of terror. There was a violent system for the sailors. There was a much more violent system for the enslaved. And I think those are both factually true, clear in the evidence, but I do not make any moral equivalence between the two.
Okay. I just would state, and I'm just reading from the text where it says almost everyone was a captive in one way or another and subject to an institutional system of terror and death. I'm not sure if you're a sailor, and you even include were some of the sailors where they had a choice. You can go be on the slave ship or you can go to prison, where they're kind of being coerced into doing this. Regardless of how you got to be on the ship, if you are a sailor, in my view, I just have difficult, because I see this regularly within the system of white supremacy where somehow whites end up being victims of racism. And to me, this sounds very similar to the same type of argument. And I categorically reject that. I don't hear any other crime talked about where the perpetrators, and if you are a slave ship sailor, you are for sure a perpetrator in the crime of enslaving black people, where the perpetrators and the victims all get classified together as being victims in some way. That is it's absurd. And I don't hear that logic. I don't hear that suggested for any other crime.
Mm-hmm. I would just have your readers read the book and see what they think about what I say.
Cover to cover. And I would pair that with you being a white man and writing this sort of book. I would pair that sentiment when you write later in the book. This is about Newton again, John Newton. And even though Newton was probably less cruel than most 18th century slave ship captains, he nonetheless faced mutiny by his sailors and insurrections by his slaves. That sort of thing as well. I hear consistently, or I read consistently, when white people are talking about the enslavement of black people, there always is mentioned some white person who was less cruel, less mean. Maybe he didn't rape as many black people. Maybe he didn't kill as many black people. Maybe he didn't lash as hard. Maybe she didn't sell off as many of the black people. This notion of a nicer, kindler racist somewhere on the plantation or the slave ship. What would your response to that be?
I think that's a selective reading of the book, because what I say of the slave ship captain is that it is not a moral failing of the slave ship captain that he used extreme violence against the enslaved. It was a requirement of that job. In other words, this is a structural feature. So where I come down on this is basically to emphasize I call the slave ship captain a terrorist. So my emphasis is not on one being better or nicer than another. My emphasis is on the extreme violence that flowed from all.
That is true, but I mean, you do state, that Newton was probably less cruel. That does seem like a judgment.
I don't think that was a bid for sympathy for Newton. I think that was just, that was a comment about, in which, that's linked to the larger issue of Newton's own career. Late in his life, Newton, as you know, turned against the slave trade. And he actually went and testified against the slave trade before Parliament in Great Britain. And one of the things that I point out there, just to emphasize his hypocrisy, he mentions in his testimony that some slave ship captains were known to use thumb screws on the enslaved. And your readers may well know thumb screws are an instrument of torture, in which, in most cases on the slave ship, someone who had rebelled against the slave ship had his thumbs or her thumbs put in the thumb screws after some sort of resistance, and a knob is turned, subjecting that person to extreme pain. Well, what I say in the book is that, yes, some captains did it, and what Newton did not honestly say is that he himself had done it. He had tried to kind of hide his own transgressions, but I found in probably the only unpublished document that he ever produced in his journal, actually, that after a failed uprising of enslaved people on board his ship, he had thumb screws. He had children tortured with the use of thumb screws. So I don't think this presents Newton in any way in a sympathetic light.
Oh, I'm not saying that it's presenting Newton in a sympathetic light. What I would say, in my view, not selective reading of the book, reading the book in its entirety and putting it in context, even just beyond your book, I see this consistently where there's some effort to humanize, sympathize with white terrorists, white rapists, with the slave ship sailors, that they too are captives to the system of slavery, that John Newton, even the thumb screw, and you have this portion about John Newton being less cruel. You say right after that about, yes, he was participating with these whips and chains and thumb screws and tearing all that, but even the statement prefacing all of that is him being presented as less cruel. That's just something I see consistently, where whites are describing a plantation owner, a white terrorist, as being not quite so bad. Maybe they had some redeeming qualities. They weren't as bad as, John down the road. And it continues where you, towards the end of the book, where you have, in my view, it continues, where you present a lot of the sailors who become refuse, sailors where they're injured, maybe they have parasites, they don't have any money, and so they're just kind of marooned on the beach, and, it's just down and out, it's terrible, and they just kind of get left there. I don't mind. That's accurate, that's historical, that's fine, but it's just in my view, particularly when the book kind of ends with one of these enslaved black people in the Caribbean is coming to take care of them and give them food. Like, it just, it reminds me, I see that pattern in the system of white supremacy where somehow whites are able to be redeemed or sympathized with in some way by black people, the victims of white terrorism. And you even kind of present that at the end, these enslaved black people after they've been brutalized, maybe by some of these down and out sailors, where they're going to take care of them and bury them. It's just like, I see this consistently. It's the same type of pattern, particularly when white people write these histories or writing about racism in general. I could be in error. Listeners can think about it. You can read the book for yourself, come to your own conclusion. I also did want to ask about your contribution to Roots. What was the nature of your involvement with the reboot that came out this summer?
It was actually quite minor. I was called by one of the producers. Her name was Kim Gilmore, who was a student of Robin Kelly at NYU, and she asked if they could come to me for advice about the slave ship. And it turns out I answered a few questions, but I would not describe my role as a major one at all.
What did you think of the finished product? Or did you watch it?
I haven't seen it.
Oh, okay.
I haven't seen it. It aired when I was out of the country, and I've actually not been able to see it yet.
I haven't seen it either. I don't know what your assessment. My assessment, it seems like there is just a hemorrhage of major, like, Hollywood release of films showing black bondage, whether it's on television or the big screen. You got the Roots remake, the television show Underground, the show that was on last year, The Book of Negroes, Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, 12 Years a Slave. The Freetown of Jones just came out this summer. The Good Lord Bird is scheduled to come out soon. Nate Parker's biopic on Nate Parker. Katrina Brown, we had her on the program, her documentary, Traces of the Trade. It just seems like there are a lot of these that have come out. Do you have a notion as to why bondage of black people has become such a hot television film script item?
I think it's partly a response to rising levels of protest. I think that there have been, here's the way I look at it in the longer term. In the aftermath of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, there was, based on history from below, a very broad-based demand for a new kind of history of the United States. It's actually true of other countries too, but let's just talk about this country. The image of African American people up to that time was extremely racist, and this demand that came out of these movements was basically to say, we want a new history of slavery. We want something that takes the issue of race very seriously, and this, I think, is one of the things that has driven scholarship on the question of slavery, and now it's actually having a big impact on the culture industry. Since the 1960s, since the mid-60s, I think there's probably been more high-quality scholarship on the issue of slavery than practically any other subject. It's quite extraordinary what we now know. There's still a tremendous gap between what scholars have learned and what the general public knows. Okay, so this is crucial. But I think 12 Years a Slave was something of a breakthrough. I think that the success of that film has encouraged other people to do things that probably were not conceivable 5 years ago. And I think I think the emphasis on film is really part of a continuing debate. And black artists are now playing a major role in that debate, black filmmakers.
Before I get some of our callers, do you think some of this interest could be a continuing aspect of the public consumption of Black death? Because in, I think, all of these projects, with the exception of Katrina Brown's maybe, but also all of the major films, a key element of them is just watching Black people being brutalized, beaten, whipped, raped.
Yeah, no, I think this is a real issue. I was conscious of this in writing The Slave Ship. I think there are definitely readers out there who have a kind of pornographic interest in watching violence against people of color. I do think that is an issue. I don't think as a writer or necessarily as a filmmaker one can control that. I think the most important thing that we can do is to tell the truth about what actually happened. But I do think that is an issue.
Okay. Folks that dialed in, we'll try to get see if we can get one question from the folks who called, so we can get Mr. Rediker out at 9 p.m. so he can see Hillary and Donald spar. Thomas in New York, did you have one question? Thomas in New York, you with us, sir? Okay. The astute one.
Yes, hello? Hello? I'm sorry. I was muted. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes. I'm glad you hit on it, Gus. I find that a lot of white scholars are into the slave narrative coming from Africa, but a lot of the black scholars are sitting to come up with a lot of evidence to prove that black people were here long before in the slave trade. My only question for you is what wood was used to make these slave boats?
I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear that.
What wood was used to make the slave boats? Oh,
okay. Yeah, a very good question. Now, this is actually a study in alienation. This is like the horror of the slave system. I found evidence that some of the oak being used to make vessels was actually chopped down in the Carolinas by enslaved laborers. So the people who would get off the slave ships would be forced to do the labor that would create the timber for the slave ships, and that this would then be sent to the shipyards, new slave ships would be built, and the system thereby became self-perpetuating.
The astute one, did you have a question for Mr. Marcus Rediker? You should be with us, sir.
Good evening. Mr. Rediker, I'd like to ask you, could you discuss the difference between how whites or European whites participated in the slave trade as opposed to black Africans that, supposedly aided and assisted in the slave trade itself? And
Sure.
That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, yes. In my view, the slave trade is first and foremost a European business. Now, it's true that American merchants and slave traders were also involved, but I think overwhelmingly the great majority of enslaved people were carried to the New World in vessels owned by owned by European merchants. Now, that said, those European merchants who hired captains and crews to man their ships, they had to have cooperation from coastal kingdoms in West Africa to get the enslaved people on board. So this is a very important part of the story. In fact, one of the things that I found to be most important, European slave traders were very, very good at the game of divide and conquer. So what they would do is arrive on the west coast of Africa, and this was really from Senegal all the way south to Angola. They would bring trade goods, many different kinds, but especially firearms and ammunition. And what they would ideally hope to do would be to find an African king who was willing to trade with them. This is what historians call the gun-slave cycle. To trade slaves for guns. Those guns would then be used as a technology to conduct more raids in the interior. Frequently this was a coastal king waging war against a traditional African enemy. And this cycle would continue. There were literally millions of guns carried to West Africa to try to produce ever larger numbers of slaves. So it has to be seen as a system, and there is definitely an African part to the system.
The caller at 3637, did you have one question for Mr. Rediker?
Yes, I have one question. I wanted to know, you mentioned children. I think you were saying something about a thumb contraption or some type of terroristic device that was going on, torture.
Thumb screws.
How many children were on slave ships?
Very important question. Children always made up a substantial portion of the people on slave ships, and over time, as you move from the 17th century into the 18th and the 19th century, children made up an ever greater proportion. Now, the reason for this is because the slave trade had essentially exhausted the adult population, the young adult population, young men and young women who the slave traders wanted to buy. That portion of the population, that demographic group had been so exhausted that that had two effects. that made the slave traders in Africa go further into the interior to march people further and further toward the coast, which meant that more and more people arrived in poor health. But it also meant that the number of children being sold increased. So by the time you get into the 19th century, a very large percentage of slave ships are half children. And I really think it's important to kind of take that on board, to think about the human consequences of vast numbers of children on board these ships. That's a big part of the horror, if you ask me.
Wow.
Appreciate that call. The female caller in Michigan, did you have a question for Mr. Rediker?
May I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, Gus, and to the guests. I do have one question. Who do you think is most confused about racism, white supremacy, white people or non-white people, and why?
Well, I'm not sure I would use the word confused, because I think some people recognize the value of racism and want to use it very consciously. I would say that, in my view, one reason I wrote The Slave Ship was basically in the hope that we could have an honest discussion about race and terror in American history so that we could actually imagine a better future. Again, in my view, we've made a lot of progress in the study of slavery, but the truth is, when it comes to the more extreme violence, many scholars have kind of turned their backs.
If you're not using confused, well, who do you think is most ignorant about racism?
I would say that most everybody is quite ignorant. I think that the amount of history that we actually know is fairly small. I think the public knowledge of the history of slavery is something that most dramatically needs to be taught. Now, some people have a strong vested interest in not having it taught. That they don't want to have that conversation. And that, I think, is, by and large, a majority of the white population. So I think there is tremendous ignorance about this, and I think we really need to educate people.
Interesting. Thanks for taking my call, Gus.
For sure. Roz, did you have a question for Mr. Rediker?
Yes. Greetings to you. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Greetings to you, Gus, and greetings to you, Mr. Rediker. I did have one question. Earlier in your discussion, you had made a difference between the system of brutality by separating, I guess, an individual racist from the systemic violence that was a part of the system, as far as just being meted out on black people on the slave ship. And I just wanted to ask, what would be the difference between the systemic abuse and individual brutality, when the individual brutality against black people was bolstered by the fact that there was a system, basically a global system of white supremacy that allowed the individual to be just as brutal as the systemic abuse that was on the slave ships? Thank you.
You're welcome. I think my emphasis throughout the book is on the system. Quite honestly, I think that what I've tried to understand is the way violence operated at every stage of the system of the slave trade. So I'm not very interested in individual variations. I'm interested in the violence of the system as a whole.
Could we get in a last caller before you exit, Mr. Rediker?
Sure.
All right.
One more.
0997. Did you have a question?
Yes, sir. Greetings, gentlemen. Peace. Sir, I just want to ask you this question. I do a lot of studying myself on history, and I want to ask you, the deception is so deep when you start talking about white supremacy in this country, but my take on the thing is a little bit different. When they came to this country, they found people here, they found great civilizations that rivaled anything that Europe had, other than 700 AD when Tariq went into the Rock of Gibraltar and the Moors brought their knowledge, wisdom, and understanding to the Europeans. Before that time, maybe 2 liters of a country could read, and most were totally illiterate. They lived in hovels and barns, and they acted like barbarians or Philistines. Now, another thing I like to say to you,
sir, can you just get to your question? We don't have time for a lot of speechifying. Just get to your question, please.
Yes, sir. Do you believe that the slave trade was in reverse? That they actually came here and they sent people from here to other places? George Washington, Jefferson, they bred slaves in Virginia.
It is true. There were many slave trades. There was a Native American slave trade. There was an internal slave trade, especially when the Cotton South opened up. You had huge sales and movements of Africans from the eastern states of Virginia and
not just Africans, the indigenous that were here already when they came. The copper people
there was a Native American slave trade too. Yes.
Okay.
Actually.
Okay.
Yes. In fact, one of my former students wrote an excellent book on the subject called "The Indian Slave Trade" by Alan Gillay.
All right.
Well, thank you for...
That's just a great deception. That's why I asked that question. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to run on.
Right on. Appreciate that. Thank you for the call, sir. We will let you get to Hillary and Donald as you exit. There was one portion in your book, this is in chapter 1, where you are talking about, this is Snellgrave. He's writing about some of the things that happened on the slave ship, and he talks about this one instance where a slave ship captain, he rescued a black child from being killed and brought him back on the slave ship, and he gets reunited with his mom, and word goes around that he saved this black child, and they're like, wow. And they said that it was of great service, for it gave them a good notion of white men, so we had no mutiny on our ship. And I wanted you to comment briefly before you go about, in the system of racism, this notion of a good white person, how this has been beneficial to controlling black people, maintaining the system of power.
There's no question that is a myth of the system and a major legitimation of it. And again, it goes back to what your caller was asking about. And you yourself said earlier, there will be efforts to point to a single individual to try to disguise the operation of the entire violent system. But again, that's not my emphasis in the book.
Right on. Folks, you can go to Mr. Rediker's website. It is his name, MarcusRediker.com. It's linked in the description for the program, the book we discussed this evening, The Slave Ship, A Human History. As I said, he has quite a few other books dealing with the enslavement of black people. Thank you kindly. We will let you get to the debate, okay. Mr. Rediker.
Thank you.
For sure.
Take care.
Yes, sir. You too. Context of White Supremacy. Great job being right to your questions. For folks, I would have preferred to have him on the program for 2 hours, and just a quick word on that, because we do have sometimes, most of the time it's not guests, and even most of the time it's not listeners. Like, oh my God, 2 hours, that is crazy. I've got, Donald Trump videos to watch, and Empire is coming on. You got things, you're going to be sitting here listening to Gus ramble about nothing for 2 hours. That frequently the people that we have on, if they're talking about a book or a film, we're frequently discussing projects that people invested years writing. I didn't get a chance to ask Mr. Rediker, but I'm sure he spent, more than a year researching to write this book. I know the lovely Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, she spent 15 years researching and writing that book. It is amazing. We did it in the book club, but she spent 15 years writing that book. Certainly, even in 2 hours, you're not going to get to all of the tidbits and details that are of value in the book. And certainly, if we have folks that call in, sometimes we have more callers than others. You're not going to be able to get, callers to get in and ask their questions. So some people, guests, sometimes, not too often, but sometimes guests will get riled up about it being 2 hours, and sometimes listeners as well. Information is important, and I do make an effort to try to get as much constructive info from from guests as possible, and to make time for as many listeners to get in and get their questions as well. So just on the length of the program. I know sometimes you'll hear authors and what have you, and they'll do like a 10-minute interview or a 15-minute interview. Sometimes it might take that long just to get straight on a definition of racism, which almost happened on the program today with Mr. Rediker not answering the question about is racism white supremacy. My definition of that, is it accurate? He did a lot of obfuscating standard operating procedure for whites, in my opinion. I thought that was really important, the notion that he said at the end, the notion of good white people. It reminded me of Dorothy Bullitt, if people remember, suspected race soldier, white woman, right here in my own Seattle, where she was talking about her white ancestors who were enslavers, white terrorists. That was a big notion we were talking on the program. Would it be accurate to call her relatives terrorists since they were enslaving black people in Kentucky, and she refused to do it and got really tacky and started cursing while she was on the program when she refused to answer that question. But I think that is the portion that he revealed at the end. It's really, really important because she did the same thing in saying that she thought that Dorothy Bullitt, she thought her ancestors were they weren't terrorists, but she said she thought they were kinder or gentler. They weren't as bad. And that is, it is insanely racist. And that is another one I would postulate. You're not going to hear whites, when they talk about Nazi Germany, you're not going to hear them say that, well, this was a kinder Nazi. He didn't stuff quite as many of them into the ovens. You're not going to hear that sort of foolishness when they talk about any other crime. It is only when we start talking about terrorism against the black people that now all of a sudden you have kindly racist. This racist wasn't as bad as the other one. That's why the portion in the book where he says, where he's talking about John Newton and saying that he was less cruel, just that sort of verbiage, it's nonsense. What are you talking about? Any white person that is participating in abusing and victimizing black person, there should not be any effort to try to lessen or minimize or obfuscate their role in terrorizing black people. And you see that all the time. It is constant. It is a pattern in the system of white supremacy. That's why I tied that passage as well to him saying that even the slave sailors, the slave ship sailors, that even they were captive in this instance. It's nonsense. It's the same type of thing I hear all the time, that white people are also victims of racism. It's the exact same pattern. In my view, it should be rejected at all times. And in my view, I think that is a deliberate act of racism. And he said, read the book. If you read the book, you can just, note to see if that's there. And as I said, I would put both of what I just mentioned. The John Newton was less cruel than other slave ship captains. Slave ship sailors were also captives, victims of the slave ship tyranny. And then he ends the book, as I stated while he was here, with these down and out sailors. They've got parasites and everything else. They've been injured on the voyage. They get to the Caribbean, to Jamaica, and they're just on the beach. They have all these titles for them. They're just down and out, no count, deadbeat whites, not good for anything. And he includes that enslaved black people were caring for them. If that's accurate to the historical record, that's fine. But in my view, that should not be how we conclude a book that is on the enslavement of black people with down and out white slave ship sailors being cared for by enslaved black people. That is nauseating. And it's the exact same thing Charleston has mentioned in this book. You get that all the time, where black people, that becomes center stage. We are being terrorized, but it gets shifted somehow to black people caring for and showing humanity for their white oppressors. It is absurd. It should be rejected. And in me, it's just part of the same pattern where we minimize the terrorism against black people, and somehow it has to shift back to focusing on empathizing, sympathizing, humanizing whites. That invariably, that's the way things go. One of the other things I wanted to point out, I was going to read one passage from the book that might be noteworthy. And again, Dr. Ford, that's the only reason that we did this program, is because Dr. Welsing mentioned this book specifically when she was on the program. I think it was back in 2011, where she talked about this passage, which I thought was, where she just talked about this book, period, which I thought was great. I'm going to read one portion from the book here. It is about just how regular rape was on the slave ship. And I thought the question about the number of children on these boats, I thought that was really important as well. There's another book I was trying to get the author on, Dark Places of the Earth, where it focuses on one slave ship, and he also highlights that the majority of the enslaved black people on this ship were children, and it's the exact same thing. Jerry Sandusky run wild, raping all of these little children. I mean, we're talking like 10, 11. They give some of the ages in this book, dark places of the earth. I will get the passage that I wanted to share. He writes, this is John Newton, so he's talking about some of his experiences on the slave ship. He writes, and this is from John Newton's slave ship captain, author of Amazing Grace. He writes, when the women and girls are taken on board a ship, naked, trembling, terrified, perhaps almost exhausted with cold, fatigue, and hunger, they are often exposed to the wanton rudeness of white savages. The poor creatures cannot understand the language they hear, but the looks and manners of the speakers are sufficiently intelligible. In imagination, the prey is divided upon the spot and only reserved until opportunity offers, where resistance or refusal would be utterly in vain. Even the solicitation of consent is seldom thought of. And then it goes back. This is the words of Mr. Rediker. Then he stopped, declaring this is not a subject for declamation, even though the enormities of what happened on slave ships were at the time little known here. Perhaps he and other abolitionists considered it too delicate a subject for public discussion, or perhaps they shied away because it conflicted with their desire to make the British sailor a victim of the slave trade. It seems like I just said that. And an object of popular sympathy. Seems like I just said that too. It would not do to depict him as a white savage, a sexual predator, a serial rapist. Yet that is what some slave trade sailors were. It is entirely possible that some men signed on to slaving voyages in the first place precisely because they wanted unrestricted access to the bodies of African women. Thomas Bolton implied as much when he had the recruiting mate in The Sailors Fell Well or The Guinea Outfit speak to a potential sailor of the soft African wench who awaited him if he signed on. What would a real sailor think as he joined a Rhode Island slave ship named the Free Love, Captain Wanton? ? And that's ends. I thought that was even for a white person, I thought that was pretty accurate in describing what this is, sexual terrorism, and even in my view, because that's something that I don't hear expressed often, that would have been the lure. I did, in fact, one person I can't say, Mr. Fuller, that would be part of the lure for doing this in the first place. Yes, let me be a slave ship sailor. I can go and rape all the black children I want, boys and girls. This will be great. We'll be stuck on a boat for 2 months, maybe longer. They can't go anywhere. They can't run. We can do whatever we want with them. Jerry Sandusky, run wild. Anywho, my addendum, I'll get folks if they have commentary on what they heard from Mr. Rediker. The only other thing I would say, when I've said for a while, I'm not watching any slave. Same thing I've said about the police shooting videos. I don't care if they, or I do care. I think it would be correct for them to release the footage of Mr. Scott in North Carolina, but I'm not watching it. I think it serves the exact same purpose as having black people on a slave ship gather to see a black mother being lowered into the water and eaten by sharks. It is the exact same practice, the exact same modus operandi to get that in your mind. You're worthless. You niggers, we can do whatever we want to you whenever we want, and there is no recourse. Get that in your mind. This can happen to you. I think it's total psychological warfare, psychological terrorism against black people. It's the same thing as the lynching photos. I think Richard Wright talked about that, having said that he never was at a lynching. He was never, present for one, but he was terrified by the notion, knowing that this happened to black people all the time. I think it's the exact same thing to just have it just be an image every other day, every week, new black person, black father, black mother, black child, gunned down in the street, and we leave the body out for a number of hours and it's the exact same function. So I don't watch the police shooting videos, and I don't watch the slave flicks for the exact same reason as he, I think, correctly said, making terror porn of viewing black suffering. I think that's why they keep pushing out all of these products. Whites, we've had some of them on the program. The white man from Caucasian Persuasion, Mr. King, that's his last name, where he came on, he said he loved Django Unchained. Yes, let's go watch some more niggers being beaten down on the plantation. Oh, love it. That's what he said. And I think that's why you have all of these flicks continue to come out. But that, I think, I am okay with not watching either because I still do my homework as it relates to the slave ship. Just this year alone, we have read quite a few different books, had guests on dealing with enslavement of black people. We did in the book club, Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told. We had Ned and Constance Sublett on the program earlier this year. One of the best books I've read this year, The American Slave Coast, where they also make it central that the rape of black females was one of the definitive mandatory aspects, central aspects of the enslavement of black people. We did the Zong, which also got mentioned in this book, about the black people that were thrown overboard in the Caribbean, and then the whites went back and filed insurance for the losses after they tossed more than 100 black people overboard. This book, we've done quite a few books on slavery, and this is all just this year. So I definitely do not feel like, because I've had some people criticize the stance that I've taken and say, well, you're not making an effort to learn about this, and there could be some lessons. Contraire, mon frères, I feel like I invest a lot of time studying, and in my view, you would do much better to get books and read about this as opposed to going to watch nonsense like Django Unchained, The Free State of Jones, Traces of the Trade. In fact, I can't even think of a film that I would recommend if you were going to learn about slavery. I can't think of one. Maybe Goodbye, Uncle Tom. That might be about it. And I think anyone who has listened, if you listen to The Half Has Never Been Told, we did the book club, or any of the guests when we had the Sublets on to talk about the American Slave Coast, I think any of the time, if you've heard some of the stories that we've done when we've reviewed these books, the detail is way worse in terms of what was actually happening, that I have not seen one movie that comes close to including all the details from what we heard today and other times that we've discussed some of these books dealing with this topic. With that, folks have commentary they would like to share. The number to dial, 641-715-3640. The code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you have commentary. The number again, 641-715-3640. The code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. I will try to nab the people who did not get a chance to ask a question first to see if they have commentary. People that didn't get a chance to ask a question, retired firefighter, caller at 9440 and caller at 2812. Since you all didn't get to ask a question, did you have commentary, anything you wanted to share?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, greetings. Very interesting. I wanted to ask him about his statement when he was talking about that there's been a lot of academic progress, and I wanted to really ask him about, has that progress, enhanced or helped non-white people in the system of white supremacy? And I sent you an article a little bit earlier for the interview he did, and I just wanted to read one excerpt real quick. It'll take about a couple seconds. Somebody asked him about reparations in the United States, and I quote him, and he says, "I think it would be absolutely impossible in this country because the majority of the white population is utterly opposed to reparations and would not like to remember slavery in any way that might lead to economic and political conclusions. The difference is that the people who want to remember in Israel are in charge of the government. John Conyers has for many years proposed at the beginning of each Congress a bill to study the effects of slavery and in American history. Every year it's voted down, and I always go back to what you say consistently when people are talking about progress or some of these bills that are getting done. You always say it is not a bunch of black people voting for these bills. It is a majority white people. So I wanted to ask him about that, and then also ask him about the excerpt in this interview where he said that he was an honorary black person. What does that mean, and does he still feel that he gets benefits being an honorary black person? And I'll mute my line. Thanks, Gus.
Appreciate that. I did ask him at the beginning of the interview about the honorary black person part.
I missed it. Yeah,
it'll be in the archive, but I didn't ask him if he still gets his honorary black card. But I definitely the progress part would have been great to ask. I always think that should be a word that we are very alert to when any white person uses that word when talking about racism, white supremacy, some notion of progress. It would have been great to hear his response to that as well. But thank you for the article. That was a great find. Other folks that did not. Go ahead, retired firefighter.
Greetings, everyone. I was listening for the most part, and a thought just came to my mind on what I think a writer should be responsible for, especially a writer who is a white person suspected racist. They should include, when they have these subjects on enslavement, on how it manifests itself today and under the system of racist white supremacy, and also what is their ideas for a solution to the problem. For the most part, it just handed off almost separate from white supremacy, in a sense, where enslaving non-white people is one of the strategies of racism, of the global system of racism, white supremacy, and I'm kind of like going in a circle, but like I said, it should be responsible for including in their books on how does that manifest today and their answer to the problem of racism, white supremacy. That's my thoughts.
Take it.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Gus, I'm a first-time caller into the show. I've been listening to your shows and your podcast for about 2 weeks now. And I remember hearing the author, when you talk about with the author about how the last part, especially how whites sometimes try to excuse almost or almost bring the humanity out of the characters who who are perpetrating in the system of global white supremacy. And I went through that similar thing with a coworker about a week ago when he asked me about the Colin Kaepernick situation, and he went into detail about how his grandfather came over here and worked for nothing. And I just found it, like you were saying, I think you were implying how insulting it was for him to compare maybe what his grandfather went through to what generations of my ancestors or our ancestors have went through. And it just was, I had to explain to him, and then after he heard it, he kind of looked at me and he was like, he just kind of had to step back and go, okay, maybe I shouldn't, go about it trying to weave my narrative with yours in the conclude that, well, they're the same. So, I just think to me, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to just say, I put myself up by my bootstraps. Why can't you? That's all I have to say.
First-time caller, awesome. Hope you've been getting some constructive information from the program. That sounds like workplace racism right there for the Thursday program. Get our plug in. The only thing I was going to say is you're exactly correct. In my view, it's the exact same thing. This likely race soldier on your job basically saying, you niggers just need to get yourself together. My folks came over here and didn't have anything, and now we got it under control. You all can do the same thing. That whole you just need to work, meritocracy, bootstrap ideology, all of that. It's the exact same thing. And one thing that I do think is important is that frequently racists will portray us as talking about this as we are offended or insulted, and it gives the impression that I'm just a person where you hurt my feelings by something that you did. And I think it's very important, this comparison, this notion that, either white people worked hard and why can't you, or somehow sympathizing, minimizing the terrorism that has been done to black people, it's inaccurate to compare a white person who came here from anywhere in the world to any black person in any era. It's not, that I am offended or my feelings are hurt. It is totally inaccurate. And white people know this in terms of what their experience is going to be and what the experience is going to be for a black person, a non-white person, period. So I do try, and I might have failed at this today or have failed at it previously. I think it is important to make sure that we use words, even though on a personal level it is insulting, but that's not the way that you want to articulate it. You just want to stick to it is totally inaccurate. And it is an act of racism because you are not being truthful. And the same thing that I say consistently when they make those analogies and comparisons, you're comparing things that are not equivalent. His situation is not equivalent to a black person who's a victim of racism. And it's the same thing when you try to say that, the slave ship sailors, that they were captives in this endeavor too. That is absurd. In my view, it's not accurate. It's not logical. It's an act of racism. And you'll see this pattern consistently when whites are talking about any era of racism. Hope that makes sense. I think we got all of our folks who did not get a chance to ask a question. All of the people who dialed in, who did get a chance to ask a question, thank everyone for being brief. Bravo, getting right to your questions. Great job. Did you all have comments that you wanted to share?
May I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm sorry, Gus. Look, all I was trying to do, because he was acting like, and maybe he didn't, I don't know what he knows, so I won't even suppose. But what I wanted to know, did he know that slavery was in reverse? Because when they came to this country initially, they snatched all the girls and young women that they could, as young as 8 years old. Not only did they do that, once they snatched them, they took them up into the slave forts up in Africa, West Africa, called Judah. So a lot of slaves that came from America, the indigenous, were taken there, and they were sent to Europe and to Arabia. And the other part of that was, I wanted to know, was he familiar? Because see, white people will never talk about Tariq and the Rock of Gibraltar and the Moors running Spain, and that the Europeans were barbarians until the Moors of Spain came into Europe and educated them, taught them everything they knew. As a matter of fact, that Gunny was talking about, that bang stick was created by the Moors, but they didn't use it for a lethal weapon. They used them as weapons, but not like the European. Ferdinand, Isabella, his people, the Portuguese, they got together, they conspired against the Moors. When they put the Moors out, that was the summation of the change in the power, so to speak, from the Byzantine Empire, which was all black. King James, he's black. I could go on and on. I don't know if people are following me or not. Some people might think I'm way off base, but if you do your research, you'll find I'm on point. I just wanted to know what he knew. And the only way I could do that is by speaking those words. So I just wanted to see how he was going to come about. And then he said the slave trade was in reverse, but that's all. He didn't elaborate on it at all. And I'm pretty sure if he's an educator, he knows these things. And like I go to the University of Chicago, to the Oriental Museum. I'm going looking for information on the Moors. They always tell me when I ask these questions, oh, we don't know anything about it. Then I go to their bookshelves and I find Dogs of War. I find books that I see in other publications that you can't buy in a normal bookstore. But the University of Chicago, the Oriental Museum I'm talking about, is funded by Rockefeller, the same person that owns the educational system for the United States of America. So that's all I wanted, Gus. And I wasn't trying to, be long-winded, but I just wanted to kind of pigeonhole him to see what he knew. And I still didn't find out. But I'm pretty sure if he's a historian, the things that I'm talking about, he knows. Because I'm just a regular Joe Blow.
Right on. Yeah, it's just, if the guest is only going to be here for an hour, then it drastically minimizes the amount of time we have to work with. That's why I was just trying to see if we could get in as many folks as possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been a problem to, try to get.
Because he still didn't let me know what he knew. I just wanted to know, like what I was saying, that they were breeding slaves. So, they had an embargo on slaves. I'm not sure if it was Washington or Alexander who said, why bring the sons of Africa into America? We already got enough copper-colored people here already, because they were trying to take America at that time with the 1452 Dum Divers, when the Pope cut loose these savages on the world of the indigenous people. But that's another story. But thank you.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right. Greetings again, Gus. Great show. I just thought he was practicing racism quite a bit. Even when I asked the question about what's the difference between individual white brutality and systemic brutality, because just like you said, this is a global system of people. It takes individuals to create a system like this. So I just thought he was really full of a whole lot of nonsense when he made that whole discussion. It just made no sense to me. And he did what white people always do, which is to compartmentalize and separate things so that they focus you on the things they want you to pay attention to, and the things that are more important you tend to gloss over. To speak of when he talked about the white people being very good at the whole concept of divide and conquer, the origins of that they learned from the Arabs. If you study Arab history, there was a revolt in Iraq in which they had black people from Tanzania and the Zanzibar area in the salt marshes of the Euphrates and Tigris River. And they had basically farm tools that they were using to clear the plant life away so that they can get to the salt. And they were so brutalized that the people actually rose up in revolt and took those farm implements and really put it to the Arabs in a way in which actually that revolt was basically the matter of fact is Dr. Inoka Rashidi discusses it, and he has an article about it that's really insightful. But he said had black people won, the entire history of the Middle East would be completely different to what we know it today, and black people would be in control. They came very close to completely overrunning that area. It was just that they called for reinforcements and suppressed the rebellion, but it was a very, very important rebellion in the history of black people. And I found that interesting as well when he went to, again, play the blame game where he said that Africans were, of course, complicit in the slave trade. What he refuses to discuss is the fact that those so-called Africans who were complicit in the slave trade, the vast majority of them were mulatto. The vast majority, even Tipple Tip had an Arab father and an African mother. So the people who they're calling African were actually the same people that Dr. John Henrik Clarke and Dr. Chancellor Williams talked about in the destruction of black civilization, being that mulatto buffer class. And they basically align themselves with their racist fathers against their black African mothers in order to sell black people off into slavery. And I find that to be something that's very glossed over by historians, and him being a historian, I'm sure he knows about that, but that is something that I've never heard discussed very often, especially by white people when it comes to discussing the so-called African involvement in the slave trade. They don't bring up the fact that for every other oppressed people, whether they were indigenous Americans to, white Jews in Germany, none of those atrocities would be possible without some cooperation from the victims in some form or fashion. But the only people that are discussed in this manner are black people. No one ever talks about the fact that Zionist Jews were complicit with Germans in killing their fellow countrymen. No one talks about that. So thank you, and I'll mute my line.
The one thing he did have in his book that I did think was important is he says explicitly that most of the people that were taken enslaved from the continent, they were stolen. It was not, some black person handed them over or what have you. He does state explicitly that most of the people who got there, they were stolen, tricked, that it was not, just a black person handing over a black person. That is not how most of these people ended up on these terror ships. Any of the other folks who called in did get to ask a question. Did you have commentary you wanted to share? All the folks who dialed in who got a question, anything else they wanted to make sure they get in observation by what they heard from Mr. Rediker?
Good evening. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, definitely practicing racism. You don't want to answer the question. Oh, man, I never sort of heard anyone divert from that question quite that man. Your definition of racism. I don't think accurate would be a good term. I mean, what better term could you use than accurate? It's a white word. I'm enthused by the caller from Chicago, University of Chicago, because I came to some of those same points, which was why I asked him, well, what kind of wood was used to make these boats, because oak is only indigenous to the United States and to China, not in Europe at all. In fact, they don't have any wood strong enough to make a boat that can make that voyage from Europe, other than in Russia. When you go way up in here, these are the English and the Dutch, so they say, and the Germans. So I never could buy that slave story. So I think that anytime these white people put out books about a slave ship and stuff, they're completely lying, and they're practicing white supremacy to keep us away from looking right here for our roots, as opposed to looking somewhere where we can never find nothing. We're never going to find nothing in Africa. We're from here, so it's a bait and switch, so to speak. As far as I know, the slave trade went straight down to Mississippi, from the north to the south, and that's what I've learned in my study of the huge slave trade that they're talking about. I don't buy the Indian story. I've never seen an Indian. I don't see Mexicans or white people on reservations. I don't see no Indians, no red people, none of the people with feathers in their head that they depict in the movies that invented the Indian was in the Hollywood movie. Those people don't exist, so I don't get none of that. Only people I see here at a certain point was black people and white people. And the only thing they could tell us is they took those black people on slave ships with no refrigerators or none of these amenities that you would need to feed that many people for that many weeks. All the way over here, it just doesn't add up to me. And where are all these slave ships today? None of them were put in museums, put back together, found. I haven't seen any. I only seen replicas that they made, but we don't know, if that's really what it was. So I just don't buy the story, and I think he was practicing white supremacy by selling us on that African slavery.
Anybody else have commentary? They wanted to make sure they got in what they heard from Mr. Rediker.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, guys, this is your first time caller. New out of Kansas City. Made that first comment there. What really kind of bothers me though about it is that seems like a nice enough guy. You don't really know him outside of that. Is that these, that it appears to me in my years of going to school that these are the same academics that are teaching us, anybody else, these stories and these histories. And so it's a concern of mine, as was pointed out earlier in the interview with him, is that the narratives and the views and maybe even the conscious or unconscious biases that come into this has a way of affecting the narrative and by virtue affecting the people who are being taught, whether that be children, whether it be college students, or anything else. And so, for me, what's helped me to take the veils off my eyes is looking, for myself, reading some of these firsthand accounts, these narratives, reading about some of these people, and investing time for myself to see exactly what was what, for me to get a better understanding. I feel it feels unfortunate though that a lot of us don't have the means, or it's not available, or just maybe even through sheer just interest to research it, to self-teach and self-research these things, so that we keep it in proper perspective and narrative when we're going about these things, because it can become dangerous, in my opinion. That's all I have to say.
That's interesting. The caller at 0972, did you have a comment you were going to share, sir? Ma'am, sir?
Yes, I'm Dave, and I'm a truck driver. So it's invaluable radio. You and Scotty and the archives you're able to listen to. And I don't know if his book kind of concentrated, I believe another caller had asked about the wood, but I remember from one of the archives where Mr. Fuller had stated, about storms and things like that. So, of course, the deplorable conditions of all times of the seasons, even, the seas and so forth. I remember in particular, he said, we could put, 2,000 in them if we stack them up right, But I guess my question was more a technical thing, and I don't know if his book went into that as much as far as the construction, as far as are there any remnants left, from that aspect, because many persons may have seen the illustration of how, the non-white people were configured onto the ships, but, if there's any rigging left, any other things like that, to try to get an idea of the absolute horror and the duration and time and seasons. Again, I'm sure it was cold at some times. I'm sure it was unbearably hot. And as Mr. Fuller said, again, from being able to listen to the archives, living in a toilet for all that time. I think it was even something I heard about the smell being so bad that, they were disembarked and embarked. Again, because I am in the kind of trucking business, I see what it's like, or could imagine, cattle, we call them bull haulers, with the cattle carts, how they, even if they need to get some fuel or something, the incredible smell and, the distress of the animals and just the real concept of that. I mean, I don't want to go too far, but how they have some of these Civil War reenactments, I would wonder if that reenactment, not as such, but if that reenactment could be done, if they could actually simulate that, if persons would be able to understand the depth and magnitude of that aspect of racism, white supremacy. And like I said, I don't know if he went into that in the book, but, from the physical aspects, the characteristics of the ships, now this death and horror therein.
He does go into some of the specifics, like giving dimensions and illustrations with instructions on how enslaved black people are supposed to be packed, and there is some detail on that. And I think to the point that was raised earlier, I was thinking that the new museum that they just opened, I would be surprised if they did not have some relics of a slave ship. They might even have an entire slave ship that they've rolled in. And lo and behold, they did have several articles that were talking about that they have reconstructed a portion of a slave ship at the new museum that just opened this past weekend. So I don't know if I know we have people that are in the Washington, D.C. area. So maybe people can go check it out and give a report, ask some questions if they have a guide or someone who's giving a lecture associated with this exhibit. But that might be a reason to go to the museum, check it out so you can ask questions and do some investigating, see if there are some deceptions. There would have to be, I would think, at the new Smithsonian African American Museum.
Yes. And, again, so we have an accurate portrayal, so we have a true account. Like I said, I can see the poor little animals, whatever it is, in back of the trailer that they're hauling from here to there, chickens, so forth. So, I mean, what's the difference? But also from the aspect of, well, they want to have a romanticized version of the Civil War enactment, and they've done all these kind of little hats and, have the little, and that, just to see how insipid it actually was. There was nothing romantic about it, and so they were the sailors on the high seas, and, again, that was from Mr. Fuller, one of the archives, where he says, hey, the sailors got it pretty hard too, he ain't such a bad guy. It's like, no, these are absolute barbaric conditions. But thank you very much, and I'll be calling again.
For sure. Appreciate that. I can
God
just...
bless you. Thank you.
I would just say on a personal level, and this is the same reason why I don't watch the slave flicks, I would not have any interest in seeing a reenactment of anything related to slavery. If they did it correctly, it would probably be something that I think a lot of people would not have the stomach to sit through and watch all of that. That would
exactly.
We can pass on all of that. Is there anybody?
Most certainly.
Any other commentary folks want to make sure they got in on Mr. Rediker before we move topics? Anything else folks need to make sure they get in?
Hey, Gus?
Yes, ma'am.
Did the author, you gave your definition of racism at the beginning, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am.
Did he agree with your definition?
I'm saying no, just because he didn't answer the question. We wasted a good 5 minutes with him saying, I think he started with it is a definition, then he said that he was not comfortable with the word accurate, or he wouldn't use the word accurate to describe it, and he said that it's one of many definitions on racism. He gave his definition of racism. He did everything but answer the question about whether or not he thought it was accurate.
Okay. I was going to ask him, would he say that he had racist family members, because I did come in on I think he was saying that he had some type of respect or clout amongst black people when he was in high school or something playing basketball.
Right.
I just wanted to know if he had racist family members, and did he go talk about his clout that he had with black people with his family members. And I'm glad that somebody addressed that reparations, because that was one of my questions. So I jotted down his response on that it was impossible. And my other question was, I wonder, were they losing? How much money were they losing? Because I mean, he said every day they would go and get dead bodies and have to throw them over, and we're using sharks as terror things and all of this. So I want to ask them, I wonder how much money they were losing, or was anybody reprimanded when they would come back to the Americas with a lot less bodies. And I want to take notes of what Thomas was saying too, and what a lot of scholars are saying with that whole slave trade thing. It might be some holes in that. I mean, I'm sure it was some slave ships that made it, but I just don't know. It's just, I know I need to read some more. So those were my questions that I had for him.
Dr. Welsing certainly encouraged that for all of us. Read it. That's why we did the program. She mentioned Mr. Rediker's book on the broadcast. He does include like the, I don't know what you would want to call it, the financial breakdown for how much it would cost, at what point it would stop being profitable if a whole lot of these enslaved black people, if they started dying during the voyage, how that would, compromise how profitable the trip was. And they had a formula for how many enslaved people you would need to get across safely without them dying or anything in order to have it be a financial success for the voyage. He does talk about some of that explicitly in the book and putting, explicit numbers on it. And if you get there with too many, people are upset and blah, blah, blah. And what happens then? He does talk about that like explicitly. I think that's like a whole chapter of dealing with that also.
Okay.
Not that I'm You can get this book at the library if you really want to read it. I certainly would not encourage purchasing. I've said that for years. We don't want to purchase these white people's books. I did not purchase this one. You can get it. It won a lot of awards and such. You can go to your local library, I am sure, and get this one or any of the other books that Mr. Rediker, has written about slavery, if you want to check it out. And just make sure I get in as well, because this did kind of set the tone for the conversation. I typically do not put in the exact time. Not always. Sometimes I do tell people up front, the show is 8 to 10 or whatever it is up front. But most of the time I do not, because I am not sure how long I will want to talk to them for. If we have a lot of callers like we did today, then yes, obviously I would like them to do the whole 2. If they can stay longer, fine. That is not always the case, where I do not always need the person to be there for 2 hours. It is very rare for anyone to act a fool, particularly after they have agreed to do the program, to then cut a fool because they didn't know how long the broadcast was up front. He even, in our correspondence, because we had quite a few emails about this today. At first he said, he didn't even mention the time of the program. He just mentioned that the program coincided with the debate happening tonight between Hillary and Donald. And I was just like, you got to be kidding. That's going to be recorded and replayed ad nauseum for the next week, which is exactly what I told him. Let's be serious. We agreed to do this like weeks ago. If you really wanted to see the debate, you should have thought about that way back then. You should have had that on your calendar. I'm sure you got all kinds of gadgets gotta watch, Hillary and Donald get down tonight. I can't talk to the niggers today, but making a big to-do about that. That is atypical in my experience with, having done 1,500 programs plus, where people generally are just not in a tizzy if they agree to do the program. And if they are not able to stay the full 2 hours, then it's just, I can't stay for the full 2. I can do 90 minutes or whatever it is. And we continue rolling. It's no big deal. He made a big to-do about that before the program and wrote back and forth. And in my view, just what I would expect from a white person. Anything else folks need to get in, Mr. Rediker? Are we satisfied on that?
Yeah, I wanted to say, I just would have loved to have asked him, has he ever been engaged with a relationship with one of those black females since he had his ghetto pass.
Yeah, that would have been a good one. I'm sure if we had had the full 90 minutes, or 2 hours, I'm sure somebody would have asked that directly if I did not ask myself. I am sure his family, it would have probably been, some good questions to ask around that, in its entirety, him being an honorary black person, whatever that means. At that time, to know how his family, like whites in Virginia at that time, I am sure that he had some staunchly explicit white racist mom, white racist dad, uncles who were making comments about everything that was happening in my home state of Virginia, and even him being around all these black people, what did they think about their son or their nephew or whatever hanging out with all the niggers in Richmond, Virginia? I would have been curious to hear about that as well, but.
Hanging out with Allen Iverson and Michael Vick and them, I don't see that flying too good.
In the 1960s, no way. No way.
May I make a comment real quick?
Yes, ma'am.
I just found it interesting, and I try to make it a point to ask the white guests and non-white, if I have an opportunity, who they feel is most confused or most ignorant. And so far, of course, we hear them, say white people, but I found it interesting when you asked him about if white people are sincerely and greatly pained. He said that he was, and how he demonstrates it is by, I think he said, writing a book or writing books. And I think that's really just crazy that they think that educating, I don't know if they're educating white people or black people, that's their contribution to show that they're sincerely and greatly pained. So, and so that's what we find, these books and the movies and the things that come out, I guess, in their effort to try to educate, but it's just interesting. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Great observation. Yeah, I think he did say that he did not think the majority of whites are sincerely greatly pained by racism eventually. But yeah, I did think that was fascinating when he said he was, and the evidence was by writing these books, which he is compensated for doing. Yeah, and certainly the ignorance thing, when I asked him who the demographics of his readers, his reading audience, and he said that he thinks it's mixed. My suspicion is that even though, again, Dr. Welsing, that's who she just referenced the book. She didn't recommend it per se. But Dr. Welsing, she was the one who mentioned this book in the first place. I suspect mostly whites. I suspect his readers are predominantly white for this book. I could be in error. Has anybody on this call read this book, The Slave Ship, Marcus Rediker? Anybody here read this book?
No.
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 I have. He did a talk on Book TV. You can check out. I couldn't see everybody, but it looked to me like it was mostly whites in attendance, and that has been my experience. We mentioned Edward Baptist. He said that was one of his students. We read The Half Has Never Been Told. I saw him give book talks. It looked like the crowd, to me, it looked like mostly white people. Isabel Wilkerson, I've heard her give talks. Most of the audience that I've seen, they've been mostly white people. I am sure as a black author that there are a lot of black people who read her book. Plus it got a lot of attention. It was on President Obama's book reading list a couple summers back. But I strongly suspect that it would be mostly whites who would be reading a book like this. I could be in error. I could be in error, but I'll stick with that until I get evidence to the contrary. Anything else folks need to get in, Mr. Rediker?
Hey, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Hey, the narrative is always the slave narrative. They don't want to start from a different perspective. As far as it's 1,500 pyramids on the Mississippi River here in the United States that you probably never hear of. Illinois has pyramids. Wisconsin, they never speak on this. And see, I heard somebody say earlier, this is information that could get you killed because people don't want you to have this information. Unless you do some digging and some real study, you won't know these things. And it's not meant to be known. The narrative is when you hear these Caucasians screaming, we are American. No, you're not American. You're a Philistine. You're an invader of a country. The indigenous people look like you and I. But we weren't taught that because everything is deception. And that's all I have to say, man. Peace.
I wanted to chime in, too, with an addendum. When white people met Arabs on the continent, it was the Arabs who actually told them to take slaves from different places so that they didn't speak the same language, so it would make it easier for them not to revolt due to their lack of communication. And that was because of the incident. It's called the Revolt of the Zanj people, Z-A-N-J. That's the revolt in which the black slaves in Iraq almost overthrew the entire Middle East as we know it today. And it was because of that particular incident that Arabs started to tell Europeans, make sure you take these people from different places so that it's harder for them to form a revolt against you, whether it's on the slave ship, on the way to the slave ship, or once they arrived here. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Right on. We should be here on Wednesday as well. We should have a white female on the program. One of our investors, I think it was her sister. Was talking about the incidents that were happening last week, the protests and everything going on in Charlotte. And one of her social media homies, this white woman, Kelly Freeman is her name. She hopped in and started talking about how she hated white people and white people are the worst and they're so racist and she's white and she can't stand white people because she sees what they do to black people. And she said, well, I don't know if she said to get her on the program, but she shared all of this with me, this exchange from this white woman. And this would be a cowbell as well. She's married to a black male. So I reached out to see if she'd be willing to come on the program to get further detail. So that should be this coming Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Kelly Freeman, suspected race soldier, white woman. Should be a hoot, hopefully constructive. I also wanted to make sure I got a word in. I know this is simultaneous with the debate, And I am extra comfortable with that. As I stated earlier, I am sure that everyone by Friday will be sick of hearing about the debate because there'll be so much coverage. And that's one thing that I would say in the system of white supremacy. It's difficult to assess value. We're talking about a system that is primarily based in deception. I think racists, one of the things that they do, as I just stated, they make it very difficult to assess truth. What is accurate, as many of the callers have touched on, they make it difficult to accurately assess value. And anything, in my opinion, that is being excessively hyped and whites are just talking about it and demanding that you invest your time and energy in something, in my view, at least, there should be a pause to reassess to make sure this is a constructive investment of our time and energy. And that this is somehow going to prove beneficial for us in some way, shape, form. And I think with the presidential election, they require such a massive expenditure of time and energy. This is something that has got to be important and followed and talked about for a year and a half, if not longer, that we've been talking about all this. That's not even normal. They don't even have the election process in many other countries around the world is nowhere near that long. It certainly does not require this much, this great an expenditure of time and energy. So just on that alone, I think it is good sometimes to step back, reassess. I am sure that the entire debate will be available on YouTube and many other mediums tonight, hours from the time that this program ends. And you can watch to your heart is content and go back and get all of the live tweets and the analysis that they'll be talking about until whenever the next debate is. But I'm not saying it's not important, but I do have caution around anything that whites are demanding that we all stop and pay attention. I think one of the articles that I saw, one of the earlier articles that I saw talking about the debate, they were just talking about the ratings. They weren't even talking about questions or, things you should look out for, just the ratings. Man, we're going to have millions of folks tuned in to watch all of this as though this is, scandal or a football game or something that we're discussing. Did anything debate related folks want to make sure they get in? I'm sure we'll have ample time to discuss. I don't know if people have been paying attention. I think it started about an hour ago. Anything related to that, or folks?
I will say something. I'm not watching. I'm not listening to it because, of course, I'm on the show, which is more important to me than seeing these two actors and characters. But I was watching it as I'm listening to the show, and I saw a commercial for a documentary that I believe it's Ava DuVernay is putting out called 13. And it specifically is speaking about the First Amendment and the fact that slavery was never abolished in this country. And I saw a very extensive clip where they showed back-to-back images of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and then Bill and Hillary Clinton, all. And I have a feeling that in that documentary they're going to address Bill and Hillary Clinton's role in the incarceration of multiple generations of black people. So I'm hoping that this comes out before the election so that black people can get a better understanding of the bleached fecal matter that they're trying to put up for us to vote for in the form of Hillary Clinton. Thank you.
That is interesting. I can't, I'm stunned they allowed that to play during the debates. If I was in the Hillary campaign, I would be furious. Like we after we're done with Bill Cosby, we're going to get Ava DuVernay to have that being played while I'm debating here. Have folks thinking that I'm not one of the well-meaning whites. Like, oh man, that's terrible.
I was shocked too when I saw it. I was like, really? And I was like, oh, I literally was taken aback. But because of the the discussion with Mr. Rediker's book, I didn't think you would bring this up. But when you brought it up, I said there's no way for me to let it go by because I found just the commercial, and it was a decent length commercial. But when I saw those clips, and they literally showed Nixon first, and immediately after that Ronald Reagan, and immediately after that Bill Clinton and Hillary, and I was like, oh my gosh, that means they're really going to start putting this stuff out there, and I hope this comes out so that massive amounts of black people can really get an understanding for who and what she is. And of course, like you said before, I think you said this the other day, I would prefer to deal with the Donald Duck simply because at least we know what we're dealing with. He is an arch racist. He is, unabashedly so, and he's stupid enough to keep telling who he is on a regular basis. Whereas with her, she is as deadly as Margaret Thatcher. Thank you, and I'll mute my line.
Looks like it should be coming out on October 7th, so that's a month before the election. It's scheduled for limited theater release, and it'll be on Netflix October 7. If folks want to be on the lookout.
Now, you know, she might end up closing down those movie theaters because, you know, when Dr. Drew brought up her health issues, she got him kicked off his own show. So she might end up trying to close them bad boys down after they show the documentary. But I'm glad they're showing it early enough that it'll give us at least a month's time for black people to get to view it.
Fascinating. Will be interesting to see how all this plays out over the next month. Anything else folks need to get in debate related? If folks have had it on, or if you're in front of a TV where you're listening to the program, anything stood out related to that?
Well, if I could speak, I did not see the debate, but of course, I would like to see, like, for example, Eisenhower, the interstate system, Kennedy, the space system. So which one of these persons are thinking about doing anything constructive that would benefit people? I'm somewhat being facetious. But, if I could hear something in agriculture, heard during one of the news breaks on a radio show, wildfires, something helpful for people. But I expect not.
That's about where I am. I'm sure that they might give lip service to that. I suspect particularly Hillary Clinton might be very good at giving lip service as though she's going to do something in those areas, but I do not expect anything. And what I said all along, even going all the way back to January, as I said, they make you focus on this for a long, long time. When people were talking about Bernie Sanders, and I just said because of my understanding of white supremacy, and it's somewhat connected to the logic of why Dr. Welsing thought Donald Trump was going to win the presidency, I think racists, whites in this area, particularly with all the talk about the increased non-white population, I just do not see white people investing anything in what they call infrastructure, improving roads, improving the healthcare system, and improving public education. Any infrastructure needs, I just do not see them investing. And there's even been scholarship where whites have explicitly stated that you're going to, and as they've also been talking simultaneously about what they call the graying of America, where the white population, they're not having as many children. So in aggregate, their average age of their population, the white people in this part of the world, they're getting older. And so they've been calling it the graying of America, as you have increasing numbers of older white people. They are just not going to invest their tax dollars in what they perceive as an increasingly melanated area of the world. They are not going to invest in, the next generation of dark children doing well. So I just don't see any sort of infrastructure needs being met on a wide-scale basis. Maybe piecemeal, maybe in areas where you have higher concentrations of white, like here, Washington State, maybe, but on a wide scale, and particularly in areas where you have higher concentrations of dark people, no way. Anything else? Folks satisfied? Anything else they need to make sure they get in? The caller at 4789, did you have commentary?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say that when you were talking about the who read this guy's book, and you gave the examples of Isabel Wilkerson's work, I just started reading the book not too long ago, and I was walking into an airplane, and a white guy just stopped me and said, "Oh, I read that 2 years ago." And I was like, "Oh, okay, wow, okay." And I just said, "Okay," and then I kept on walking. So most of these books are written, are read mostly by white people. I also had a a small statement. I'm just hoping that, like, the guy that was talking about the pyramids in Mississippi and whatnot, like, I hope he does something. Like, I don't know if he can take pictures or if he can write a book or write an art or something where that he can enlighten us that live in other parts of the country or the world so that we can actually see this. So thanks for letting me speak. Thank you.
Excuse me, Gus, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Listen, all you have to do is Google pyramids on the Mississippi. There are also pyramids in the Grand Canyon called the Isis Temple. Man, this country is full of things. I'm trying to see. Oh, you can go to a website called www.realhistory.com, and you can pull up anything that you can imagine on there as far as indigenous people, the Byzantine Empire, the Moors of Spain, the Mesopotamia, some Sumerian texts, all kind of www.realhistory.com. And pyramids on Mississippi, just Google it. It's a pyramid, Poverty Point, Louisiana. There's pyramids in Illinois, in Wisconsin. They call them mounds. The Mississippi River, remember this, when the African ships did come, they would drop down into Mississippi, down the Mississippi River. And that's when they would go right on down the route and drop slaves, pick slaves up and take them back up into Judah, up into West Africa, the slave port where they did all. From there, slaves would be transported from there into Arabia and all points away from America. Because basically, you'll find out if you do a lot of research, it was basically in reverse because they already had plenty of copper-colored people here. And that's all I have to say. And you know what, Jerry, a lot of people really don't know about this because everything that we've been taught makes us go away from here looking for our identity in another land. But just always remember this. They never sent us out of this country. If we weren't from here, they'd put you out. You're home already. But do your research. I don't want anybody to believe me. I want you to believe what you find for yourself. Peace.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Right on. Folks satisfied? Anything else? Folks need to make sure they get in before we wrap things up.
If I could, just briefly, I remember that the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire not once, but a few times. You know, the bridge collapse in St. Paul, Minneapolis area. You know, so that kind of again goes to what Mr. Fuller had said about, you know, they'll even suffer some things to happen to them, but not a Bhopal. You know, I think the time that natural gas repository kind of blew up was an oversight, but, you know, that's just the viciousness of racism, white supremacy, that, you know, they'll take an attrition for even some of their own. But, you know, as he was saying, it's to the, you know, they've done some wonderful things, but, you know, at the expense of life, the expense of people, even their own.
Whites will sacrifice other whites, absolutely, in the maintenance of white supremacy. And whites will mistreat other whites as well. That's another thing that they will try to get you distracted with. Even Mr. Rediker brought that up in the book about how some of the white slave captains, they would abuse other white sailors on the ship. That does not make them niggers. I think that is very important to keep in mind, to not get confused when we see whites in conflict with other whites. Those are just racists bickering, which they do from time to time. That does not change our status as victims of white supremacy, and neither one of them have correct intentions for us, regardless of who, you know, is triumphant in their squabbles and bickers with themselves. With that, I assume folks are good. Again, we'll be here on Wednesday. If you have questions, guest suggestions, comments, information that you would like to share, untiljustice@gmail.com, untiljustice@gmail.com. Again, we should be here Wednesday about 48 hours. Another white person on the program. Get your questions. Always enjoy being able to question white folks. I will state again for the record, just because this did happen today, I was at the grocery store. Lovely day. This is probably the last beautiful day that we will have in the Pacific Northwest until 2017. But it was lovely. It was almost 80 degrees today. Just beautiful day in the Pacific Northwest. But like I said, just came out of the grocery store, and some terrorist white guy, he was in an evergreen tree care truck. They do like landscaping. He was in the passenger seat, and he stuck his hand out of the window like he was holding a gun and shot at me like repeatedly. And unfortunately, the terrorist acts, recognizing we are in a system of white supremacy where whites are engaged in constant war against black people in all areas of people activity at all times. I was not stunned. I did not cry. I did not say, oh, my feelings are hurt. I'm so sad. I thought this was my homie. I stopped to make sure that I could recognize the vehicle, because he was in a business vehicle. This was not like he was just out joyriding, enjoying one of the last warm days of the season. He was, apparently on his job, and made sure to remember what his top job is: practicing racism. And so I recognized the company, and I was trying to get the license plate, but it was, they do landscaping, so they have, the attachments to the back of the vehicle, so it threw off where the license plate was. So I wasn't able to get that, but I was able to get the company and the cross-section of where they were. So I called the local office for the company, and of course these are white, so they have GPS on their vehicles, and explained where they were and what happened. And it was a white woman. Asked to speak with a manager, and she says, oh my Lord, that is, I can't believe it. And in this climate where we've had all these shootings, and they just had that big shooting at the mall here last Friday where 5 whites, I think they were all exclusively white. At least the photos I saw, they all look like they'd be classified as white. But they just had that shooting here in Washington State on Friday, Burlington. And then they had a shooting earlier today in Texas, in addition to all the other police shootings and everything. And she's like, oh my Lord. And in the climate that we have now, that is, disgraceful. And, we will deal with this. I will follow up, give me your number, and I will report back to you what happens. We have our GPS, so we'll be able to track down exactly who it was. And oh my Lord, what a disgrace. I'm so happy you called. And it would not surprise me if, this person gets a raise or what have you, but I would at least encourage reporting in an effort to hopefully try to get a paper trail when whites do these sort of things. I do think that can be constructive. Not that you expect the system of racism to, fall apart as a result of making a call or making a report, or even if you call the police or whatever it is, because invariably you're going to be reporting most likely to another white person, to another racist, to deal with the problem or what have you. But I do at least think it's important, as I said, documentation. Do the same thing. They make paper trails on us so that they can go and have you in court and say, oh my gosh, this person has 15 felonies and 20 citations and all that, so that there can also be a paper trail of racist conduct on the part of as many whites as possible, just to drive up the cost of doing business, as Mr. Fuller say. But I say that just, again, it's really, really important to be mindful. War is being waged against us at all times, just to have that in mind and to take that seriously when we go out and about. I know that is a burden. I know that is super unpleasant. It is stressful to think in that manner, but it's so many times when we're not thinking that way and we're unprepared, and then something happens and we're not able to think about, the best way to respond, what to do, what not to do. We just don't have that in mind because we're not thinking constantly, particularly if you're out and about. Hey, I'm in a system of racism. Anything could happen at any time. This is what whites do. I'm going to make sure that I'm not, just thinking everything is great, and that I'm not in a situation where I could be terrorized, even killed at any moment, because it happens so frequently. And at least for me, this directly ties to why I say sobriety would be best. As I just stated, there's so many illustrations, there's so many unfortunate incidents that it comes out of nowhere. It's not a white person that you know. This is not someone that you have a history with or you all have been feuding, but it just comes from nowhere. When you're in your vehicle, you go to a gas station, or you're on the road, all these different incidents of what they call road rage and what have you, and then it ends up escalating to a serious conflict in a matter of seconds or minutes. You do not want to be under the influence and have something like that happen, and you're not able to think on your feet, as they say. You're not able to come up with the best possible solutions in terms of what to do, how you want to respond that's going to work out best for you long term. That's another reason we don't want to be under the influence of anything. Alcohol, cigarettes, cannabis, whatever. Sobriety would be best under conditions of white terrorism. Certainly if you're going to be behind the wheel, you never know when today could be the day that you bump into Darren Wilson, Daniel Holtzclaw, race soldier, white person, badge or no. They are extremely dangerous, and you don't know how all the election and everything that's happened, that could just be riling more racists up to do things. I think there's even some evidence that could be the case. So just take it seriously and keep that in mind when you're out and about. I would say share it if you have family members and friends as well. I remember the young black male in Oregon. He was visiting from Canada, and the racists just deliberately ran him over and killed him. It can happen really, really suddenly, and you just want to make sure that we're prepared, understanding the world in which we live. Thanks for everyone tuning in. Hope it was a constructive investment of your Monday evening. We will certainly catch up on the debate and everything that happens as the week rolls on. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.